The bolt pistol is still warm in my hand. Heat radiates through the leather of my glove, conducted from the barrel where the round discharged 3 seconds ago. I can feel the residual tremor of the recoil in my wrist bones, that familiar shudder of sacred destruction, traveling up through muscle and tendon into the meat of my forearm. The body at my feet is already cooling. Steam rises from the exit wound where the mass-reactive shell tore through the back of his skull, mixing with the grey morning fog that clings to everything on this miserable world. His name was Darvish. 3rd Platoon, 2nd Squad, 23 years old. I made it a point to learn that before I put the muzzle to the base of his neck and squeezed the trigger. 500 men stand in formation before me. 500 pairs of eyes watching. 500 hearts beating in chests wrapped in flak armor that will not protect them from what I represent. The silence is absolute, not the silence of an empty room or a quiet night, but the silence of collective held breath, of muscles tensed against the urge to move, of thoughts carefully controlled lest they show on faces that might be judged and found wanting. I have heard this silence 18 times before. 18 men. 18 moments where my hand raised the bolt pistol, pressed it against flesh that still lived and breathed and hoped, and rendered judgment in the Emperor's name. 18 times I have heard the wet crack of a bolt round doing what bolt rounds do to human tissue. 18 times I have smelled this particular combination of copper and promethium and voided bowels and burned hair. 18 times, and my hand no longer shakes. That is what disturbs me most in this moment, not the killing itself, though the taking of life should never become routine, not the necessity of it, though necessity is a word I have learned to hate for how often it justifies the unjustifiable. What disturbs me is the steadiness of my grip, the absolute control I maintained as I walked behind Davish, as he knelt in the mud with his hands bound behind his back, as I spoke the ritual words that I no longer hear coming from my own mouth because they have become automatic as breathing. When I executed my first man, my hand trembled so badly that I nearly missed. The round caught him in the shoulder instead of the skull, and I had to fire again while he screamed. I vomited afterward, in private, where no one could see the weakness. By the 5th execution, the trembling had diminished. By the 10th, my aim was perfect. Now, on the 19th morning of my service to the God Emperor of mankind, I am as steady as a servitor performing a programmed task. I holster the bolt pistol with the practiced motion that has become ritual. The click of the weapon seating in its holster sounds loud in the silence, a punctuation mark on Davish's ended life. I turn to face the formation. My storm coat settles around me with a weight that used to feel like authority but now feels like something else entirely. The black leather creaks as I move. The gold trim catches what little light filters through the fog. The peaked cap sits precisely aligned on my head, visor polished to mirror brightness, despite the mud and blood that marks everything else in this camp. They are looking at me, all of them. I can feel the weight of their eyes more acutely than I have ever felt enemy fire. Las rounds burning past my head carry less presence than this collective gaze. Artillery shells screaming from the sky inspire less dread than the silence of 500 men who obey me perfectly and hate me absolutely. I have earned this. The obedience, I mean. 3 months attached to the Volpone 51st Regiment, and I have successfully transformed these men from a collection of individuals with names and histories and families into a functioning weapon of the Imperium. They follow orders without question now. They hold their positions under fire. They do not break, do not flee, do not falter. The casualty reports speak to the effectiveness of my methods. Our survival rate exceeds the regimental average by 12%. 12% more of them are alive because I have been willing to kill them. The mathematics of it should be comforting. It is not. I scan the formation with the trained eye that has become second nature. looking for tells, the signs of weakness that precede failure, the slight sag in posture that suggests exhaustion beyond the physical, the 1,000-yard stare that indicates a mind beginning to fracture under the weight of what we witness daily, the micro-expressions that betray doubt, fear, the dangerous seed of cowardice that can blossom into rout and collapse. Every face I see holds the same expression. Not hatred, though that is certainly present beneath the surface. Not fear, though they are afraid of me in ways they are not afraid of the enemy. The expression I see is calculation. They are measuring distances, angles of fire, opportunities. Each man standing in formation is asking himself the same question, though none would dare speak it aloud. When will it be my turn? Who among them will I judge next? Whose name will I learn before pressing cold metal against warm skin? Which of these men, who have fought beside each other and bled for the Emperor and held the line against enemies that would devour their souls, will I kill to ensure the others continue to fight? They do not know. I do not know. That is the nature of the duty. The bolt pistol at my hip is loaded and ready. My authority is absolute within the bounds of maintaining discipline. Any infraction, any hesitation, any failure of will can and must be met with summary execution. Not because I am cruel, not because I enjoy this, because the alternative is the collapse of order, and when order collapses, everyone dies. Darvish broke. He tried to run during the artillery barrage last night. He made it perhaps 20 meters before Sergeant Carrell tackled him and held him down until I arrived. I have no doubt that Darvish would have continued running, that his fear would have infected others, that the line would have fractured where he abandoned his position, that men would have died in that breach. So I killed him instead. One death to prevent 20. One life traded for the cold calculus of survival. Justice, necessity, murder. The words have ceased to have distinct meanings. I did not always know what this silence meant. There was a time, years ago, when I believed that the stormcoat represented something noble, that the peaked cap and the bolt pistol were symbols of honor rather than instruments of isolation. I learned differently, but the learning came slowly, in increments so small that I did not notice my transformation until it was complete. The Schola Progenium does not advertise what it creates. The propaganda speaks of duty and service, of orphans given purpose in the Emperor's grand design. They do not mention that what they forge from bereaved children are weapons pointed inward, blades held at humanity's own throat to ensure compliance through terror. I was 9 years old when my parents died. My father served as a logistics officer in the Munitorum. My mother was a medici attached to the same facility. Neither died gloriously. A clerical error routed a shipment of plasma cells through an unsecured corridor. The resulting fire consumed 3 levels of the administratum complex where they worked. 247 souls returned to the Emperor that day. I was at the Scholar Youth Preparatory when the Ministorum representative arrived to inform me that I was now, officially, an orphan of imperial service. That designation carried weight. It meant I would not be abandoned to the underhive or the factory lines. It meant the Imperium would invest in my education, my training, my future. It meant I had been given a gift that billions of citizens would never receive, the opportunity to serve with purpose. The Schola Progenium on Holy Terror rises from the earth like a prayer rendered in stone and faith. Marble halls stretch for kilometers, their ceilings lost in shadows that lumen strips cannot penetrate. Every surface is carved with scripture, with the deeds of saints, with litanies of devotion that we were required to memorize and recite until the words became part of our breathing. The architecture itself was designed to inspire awe and obedience, To walk those corridors was to feel the weight of 10,000 years of human history pressing down upon your shoulders, reminding you that you were infinitesimally small and that your only meaning came from service to something infinitely larger. We rose before dawn and slept after midnight. The hours between were filled with instruction that carved away everything that might have made us individuals and replaced it with imperial doctrine. Tactical theory. The Tactica Imperium in all its variations. The measurement of morale as a quantifiable resource. The identification of weakness in others. The cultivation of authority through presence and through violence. We learned to read men the way tech priests read machine spirits, looking for the signs of malfunction that precede failure. The physical training was brutal but comprehensible. We learned to march for days without rest, to fight with blade and firearm, to endure pain with the stoicism expected of those who would lead others into suffering. But it was the doctrinal instruction that shaped us most profoundly. The endless lessons that taught us to see the Imperium not as a collection of human beings, but as a vast machine that required constant maintenance, that some parts were expendable, that the individual meant nothing when weighed against collective survival. They told us we were being forged into something sacred. Commissars, the keepers of morale, the enforcers of discipline, the representatives of the Emperor's will made manifest in the regiments we would join. We would inspire courage through our example and punish cowardice through our judgment. We were the visible reminder that every guardsman served something greater than himself, and that failure would not be tolerated. I believed every word. The memory that remains most vivid occurred in my 14th year. We had progressed to weapons training with live ammunition. The instructor, a weathered commissar whose storm coat bore the scorch marks of 100 battlefields, led us to a firing range unlike any we had used before. The targets were not the standard silhouettes or practice dummies. They were human-shaped, yes, but rendered in anatomically correct detail, dressed in flak armor and carrying laser guns, positioned as though standing in formation. We were each issued a bolt pistol. The weight of it in my adolescent hands felt like holding a piece of divinity. The weapon was beautiful in the way that instruments of death can be beautiful when crafted with reverence and skill. Blessed by the Mechanicus, inscribed with scripture. A tool designed for a single purpose. The ending of human life with maximum efficiency. The instructor's voice carried across the range with perfect clarity. You will kill more servants of the Emperor than you will ever kill enemies of mankind. This is not murder. This is necessity. He let the words settle. Let us absorb their meaning while we stood holding weapons aimed at human-shaped targets dressed in imperial uniforms. The guardsman is weak, he continued. He is drawn from the dregs of humanity, given minimal training and thrust into conflicts that would break the minds of lesser beings. Fear is his constant companion. Doubt whispers in his ear with every artillery barrage and every charge across open ground. Your duty is to make him more afraid of you than he is of the enemy. Your duty is to kill him if that fear overcomes his devotion. I raised the bolt pistol, sighted down the barrel at the target that wore the same uniform I would one day be tasked with defending. I did not hesitate. The trigger pull was smooth, the recoil manageable. The target erupted in a shower of synthetic flesh and armor fragments. The instructor nodded his approval. Good. Clean shot. Remember this moment. Remember how it feels to aim at one of our own. You will do this for real. Many times. And when you do, you will understand that this is the Emperor's mercy. One death to prevent the collapse of hundreds. One sacrifice to maintain the discipline that keeps the Imperium alive. I graduated with honors. Top marks in tactical assessment and doctrinal purity. My marksmanship scores were exemplary. The The Commissar General himself presided over the ceremony where I received my stormcoat and bolt pistol and peaked cap. He spoke of duty and honor, of the sacred trust being placed in us, of the pride we should feel in being chosen for this calling. I felt that pride. I wanted this. I volunteered for every additional training evolution. I studied beyond the required hours. I believed, with the absolute certainty that only the young and indoctrinated can achieve, that I was being prepared for glorious service. No one told me that glory and damnation could wear the same uniform. The Volpone 51st Regiment received me with the respect due to a commissar fresh from the Schola Progenium. The colonel, a pragmatic man named Hessen, who had survived 23 years of imperial service through a combination of competence and calculated ruthlessness, welcomed me to his command tent with what approached genuine warmth. The other officers maintained proper distance, but their eyes held something I interpreted as admiration. I was young, newly minted, bearing the stormcoat with the pride of someone who had not yet learned what it truly represented. I thought I was ready. I had spent years preparing for this moment. The theoretical had become practical. The abstract concept of duty had transformed into assignment orders and transport schedules, and the very real weight of a bolt pistol at my hip. I reviewed the regiment's history during the void transit to our deployment zone. 15 campaigns, acceptable casualty rates, no significant disciplinary issues in recent years. They seemed a solid unit, neither exceptional nor deficient. A good first posting for a commissar who needed to prove himself capable. The agri-world had no name that mattered. It was designated only by a string of alphanumeric characters in the Munitorum logistics database. Vast fields of some grain crop that fed a dozen hive worlds in the sector. A population of indentured laborers who worked the harvester machines and lived in prefabricated housing that was minimally better than servitor pens. The strategic value was purely economic. The Imperium required the grain. The Orcs wanted it because they wanted everything, and because burning human food supplies was nearly as satisfying to their primitive minds as burning humans themselves. The campaign was supposed to be brief. Intelligence reported a minor Orc incursion. Perhaps 300 greenskins, poorly organized, lacking heavy weapons or air support. The Volpone 51st would deploy, eliminate the Xenos threat, and move on to the next world requiring cleansing. Simple. Routine. The kind of operation that would allow me to learn the rhythms of campaign life without facing the complexities of full-scale war. Intelligence was wrong. It was wrong in the way that intelligence is always wrong when dealing with Orcs, who do not follow predictable patterns of warfare and who reproduce through spore-based biology that makes accurate population counts impossible. What we encountered was not 300 greenskins, but closer to 3,000, and they possessed looted Imperial artillery that they used with gleeful abandon, despite having no real understanding of trajectory calculations or proper firing solutions. We had been dug in for 3 weeks when it happened. 3 weeks of grinding attrition, of artillery barrages that came at random intervals, day and night, making sleep impossible and turning the fertile agri-world soil into a maze of craters filled with muddy water that smelled of chemicals and decay. 3 weeks of watching men die to shells that shrieked out of the sky, with no warning beyond the sound itself, which arrived simultaneously with the explosion that ended lives. The greenskins had found their range on our third defensive line. The shells walked up and down our trench system with methodical precision that would have been admirable if it were not so devastating. I was making my rounds, ensuring that the men remained at their posts despite the bombardment, when I saw him running. His name was Petrov. I learned it later, after. In the moment, he was simply a guardsman in flak armor, laser gun abandoned in the mud, sprinting away from his position with the desperate speed of absolute terror. His eyes were wide. his mouth open in a soundless scream that I could not hear over the shriek of incoming shells. He ran directly past me, perhaps did not even see me, focused entirely on the primal need to be anywhere other than where the earth was exploding. I drew my bolt pistol. My hand shook so badly that I nearly dropped the weapon. The training said to challenge him, to order him to halt, to give him the opportunity to return to his post before rendering final judgment. I tried to speak the words and found my throat closed around them. Petrov was already 20 meters away. 30. Running toward the rear areas where the artillery could not reach. The shell that landed in the trench he had abandoned killed the men on either side of his position. The explosion created a breach in our line. Orcs, sensing opportunity with whatever passed for tactical awareness in their primitive brains, surged forward into the gap. I watched them come. Watched as they crashed into guardsmen who should have had support on their flanks, but instead had emptiness where Petrov had stood his watch. 12 men died in that breach before we could reinforce it and push the greenskins back. Sergeant Yannick found Petrov cowering behind a supply transport, brought him to me with hands bound and head bowed. The young guardsman was weeping. Snot and tears streaked his face beneath the layer of mud that covered everything. He could not have been more than 20 years old. He tried to speak, to explain, to beg. The words came out broken and incoherent. Something about the sound of the shells, about seeing his squad mate's head disappear in an explosion, about the certainty that the next round had his name on it and he just needed to move, just needed to be somewhere else, anywhere else. I raised the bolt pistol. My hand trembled. The muzzle wavered as I tried to aim at the base of his skull where the neck meets the cranium. The proper placement for instantaneous death. Petrov was begging. Proper words now. Promises that he would never break again. That he would fight harder than anyone. That he was sorry. So very sorry. Please, please, in the Emperor's name, please. I squeezed the trigger. The round took him high, in the shoulder, because my hand shook and my aim was imperfect. He screamed. I fired again. This time the bolt did what bolt rounds do. His body collapsed forward into the mud. Steam rose from the wound. I stood there with the pistol smoking in my trembling grip and felt my stomach rebel against everything I had just done. I made it 3 steps before I vomited, bent double behind the transport where no one could see, heaving until nothing remained but dry convulsions and the taste of bile. When I emerged, the regiment was standing in formation. Colonel Hessen had assembled them to witness the aftermath. Petrov's body lay where it had fallen. No one spoke. The silence was different from the silence I know now. It held shock rather than calculation, fear rather than hatred. But the effect was identical. Rigid discipline, perfect obedience, every man standing straight despite exhaustion, despite terror, despite having watched me execute one of their own. The next artillery barrage found us in position. Not one man fled, not one man hesitated. The execution was justified. That was what disturbed me most. Petrov was not the last. He could not be the last. That is the truth I learned in the months that followed, across campaigns on worlds whose names have blurred together into a continuous landscape of mud and fire and death. Once you execute the first man, the second becomes easier. Not easy, but easier. The third, more so. By the 10th, you have developed a methodology. By the 20th, the methodology has become instinct. I began to see patterns. The way a man holds his laser gun can tell you everything about his state of mind. Too tight, knuckles white around the grip, suggests panic barely, controlled. Too loose, the weapon dangling from exhausted fingers, indicates someone who has already surrendered internally and is simply waiting for external circumstances to match his inner collapse. There is an optimal grip pressure, a balance between readiness and endurance, that marks men who will hold when others break. The eyes tell more. I learned to read them during morning assemblies, walking the formations while officers delivered briefings about objectives that rarely survived contact with the enemy. Most guardsmen maintain the 1,000-yard stare, that peculiar emptiness that comes from witnessing horrors that normal human consciousness was never designed to process. That emptiness is actually stable. It represents acceptance of their situation, a psychological adaptation that allows them to function despite everything. But sometimes you see something else, a hollowness that goes deeper than the 1,000-yard stare, a void where something essential has cracked and begun to drain away. Those men are liabilities. They will break at the worst possible moment, creating cascading failures that kill everyone around them. I started marking them. Not officially, not in any written report, but mentally cataloguing which soldiers represented weak points in the regiment's structural integrity. The voices during roll call became another diagnostic tool. A tremor in the response when a name is called. Hesitation before the affirmative. These micro-signals indicated fault lines forming in the foundation of discipline. I began to predict, with disturbing accuracy, who would fail before they failed, who would crack under the next artillery barrage, who would freeze when the enemy charged, who would run. The predictions proved correct with statistical regularity that should have been reassuring. Instead, it horrified me. I was becoming expert at identifying human weakness, at seeing men not as individuals with names and histories, but as probability matrices. Variables in an equation where the solution was always the same. Eliminate the weak to preserve the strong. Kill the one to save the many. Mathematics rendered in blood and bolt shells. We fought on a forge world where the sky burned orange with reflected heat from the plasma forges. Then, a hive world where the enemy was our own citizens corrupted by some chaos cult whose symbols hurt to look at directly. Then a frontier colony under assault by Eldar raiders whose movements were too fast to track with human eyes. Different enemies, different terrain, different tactical situations. But the internal dynamics remained constant. Men reached their breaking points. I executed them. The regiment's discipline held. We survived. The realization crept in slowly, accumulating weight like sediment forming rock over geological time. I was becoming very good at my job. Not just competent, but exceptional. My identification of potential failures before they manifested allowed me to make preemptive examples that prevented larger collapses. My execution technique had achieved mechanical perfection. My authority was absolute in ways that textbooks described, but rarely achieved in practice. This proficiency horrified me even as I recognized its necessity. Sergeant Halvan was one of the few men who still spoke to me directly. A veteran of 30 years Imperial service, he had survived through a combination of skill, luck, and the kind of pragmatic ruthlessness that kept him alive while more idealistic men died around him. He approached me after we had successfully held a defensive position against orc assaults that should have overrun us. "Commissar card," he said, offering a salute that was technically perfect, but somehow still carried an undercurrent of something other than respect. "I wanted you to know that the men appreciate your thoroughness." I studied his weathered face, trying to determine if the statement was sincere or laden with irony. His expression revealed nothing. "I perform my duty as the Emperor requires, Sergeant." "Yes, sir. And that duty has kept more of us alive than would otherwise be the case." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I've served under 7 commissars in my career. 3 died to enemy action. 2 were killed by their own troops. 1 was simply ineffective and got reassigned to rear echelon duties. You're the first I've seen who actually understands how to maintain discipline without pushing so hard that the men decide you're a bigger threat than the enemy." The words should have been a compliment. Recognition of competence from a veteran whose opinion carried weight. Instead, they felt like damnation. He was praising me for being an effective instrument of terror, for calculating the precise degree of fear required to keep men fighting without pushing them into mutiny, for becoming a machine that processed human weakness and converted it into corpses at mathematically optimal intervals. "The survival rate speaks for itself, sir," Halvan continued, 12% above regimental average. "That's your doing. The men know it, even if they hate you for it." He saluted again and left me standing there with his words echoing in my mind. 12%. 12 more men per 100 who would return home, or at least survive to fight another campaign. The price of that survival was measured in bodies I had personally killed, in the terror I inspired, in the isolation that had become my constant companion. The officers respected me but maintained careful distance. Association with the Commissar was dangerous in subtle ways, too friendly, and enlisted men might suspect favoritism or corruption. Too close, and they might witness moments of doubt or weakness that would undermine the aura of absolute authority that my position required. So the colonel and his staff treated me with formal correctness and nothing more. The enlisted men hated me. This was not speculation, but observable fact. I saw it in the way conversations stopped when I approached, in how they organized their movements to avoid crossing my path, in the careful neutrality of their expressions when forced to interact with me. I had become something separate from the regiment's normal hierarchy. Not an officer, not a soldier, but a walking reminder of consequences rendered immediate and violent. I ate alone in my quarters, slept alone with a las pistol under my pillow because I had read the reports about commissars killed in their sleep, existed in a bubble of enforced authority that was also a prison with invisible walls built from fear and necessity and the bodies of men I had judged and executed. The isolation would have been bearable if I could have convinced myself that every execution served clear justice, that each man I killed had committed an offense so obvious, so dangerous to the regiment's survival, that no other response was possible. But the universe does not offer such clean moral certainties, and eventually I faced a case that stripped away the comfortable fiction that I was merely enforcing necessary discipline. The hive world was designated Tertium 9, a sprawling vertical city that climbed 30 kilometers into a sky choked with industrial effluent. We had been sieging a fortress factory held by heretic forces for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of grinding urban combat, where every corridor was trapped and every room held enemies who knew the terrain better than we did. The fighting was close and brutal. Laser guns at ranges where you could smell your enemy's breath. Knives and entrenching tools when ammunition ran dry. Men dying in darkness so complete that you knew they were dead only when you stepped on bodies that had been warm moments before. The attrition was catastrophic, not the sudden violence of artillery that kills dozens in seconds, but the slow bleeding of casualties accumulated room by room, level by level. We lost 3 men here, 5 men there, a steady drainage that depleted our strength without offering the clarity of decisive engagement. Morale had become fragile in ways that concerned both Colonel Hessen and myself. The men were exhausted beyond anything sleep could remedy. Their eyes had taken on that hollowness I had learned to recognize as the precursor to psychological collapse. I increased my patrols, walked the positions more frequently, made my presence felt as a reminder that discipline would be maintained regardless of how tired they were or how hopeless the situation seemed. The executions during this period were justified by clear infractions. A man who abandoned his post during enemy contact. Another who struck a superior officer. Cases where the offense was obvious and the response mandated by regulations that had been written in the blood of 10,000 years of warfare. Then came Mikkel. He was 18 standard years old. barely past the age when the Munitorum conscription sweeps had taken him from whatever world had birthed him and thrown him into the machine of imperial warfare. His record was exemplary in every measurable way. He followed orders without hesitation, maintained his equipment to standards that exceeded requirements, demonstrated courage under fire that would have earned commendation in a less desperate campaign. His squad mates spoke well of him in the careful way that guardsmen speak when they know a commissar is listening. I found him sleeping at his watch post, third hour of morning, during the shift when human alertness reaches its lowest ebb. His lasgun had slipped from his hands and lay across his lap, his head tilted forward against his chest. In the dim light of the corridor he was guarding, he looked like a child who had fallen asleep waiting for parents who would never return. The enemy did not attack during his lapse. No one died as a direct consequence of his failure. The corridor he was meant to guard remained silent and empty. In practical terms, his sleeping caused no harm beyond the abstract violation of regulations. But the Tactica Imperium is explicit on this matter. Sleeping on watch is a capital offense. The reasoning is sound. You cannot predict when the enemy will strike, and the one moment of inattention might be the moment that costs everything. I woke him with a boot to his ribs. He startled awake with the panicked confusion of someone torn from deep sleep into crisis. Saw me standing over him. Saw the storm coat and the peaked cap, and understood immediately what his failure meant. The color drained from his face. He tried to stand and stumbled, exhaustion making his limbs uncoordinated. Tried to speak and could only produce a strangled sound that might have been the beginning of an apology or a plea. Sergeant Venn, who had discovered Michael and summoned me, stood at attention nearby. His expression was carefully neutral, but I could read the tension in his posture. Venn had served with Michael, had probably watched the boy prove himself in combat, was now waiting to see whether I would kill someone who had earned the right to live through demonstrated courage, or show mercy that might encourage others to slacken their duties. Colonel Hessen made the decision easier by making no decision at all. When I reported the incident, he listened with the exhausted attention of a man who had seen too much death to care about one more body. The Tactica Imperium is clear on sleeping while on watch, Commissar Kade. I leave the matter to your judgment, as is proper. He turned back to the tactical displays that showed our glacial progress through the fortress factory. The dismissal was absolute. The judgment was mine alone. I assembled the company in a chamber large enough to hold them. Made Mikkel kneel in the center where everyone could see. He wept as he knelt. Not the hysterical tears of someone begging for life, but the quiet tears of someone who understood what was coming and had already accepted it. His hands shook so badly that I had to tell him to clasp them behind his back so the trembling would not be visible to the formation. Guardsman Michael has been found sleeping at his post, I announced. My voice carried through the chamber with the practiced projection that made every word audible. This offense is capital under Imperial law. The penalty is death. I drew my bolt pistol. Mikkel bowed his head, exposed the back of his neck where the base of the skull meets the spine. The proper placement for instantaneous death. In that moment, I understood with terrible clarity that this execution was not about justice. It was not about military necessity. The enemy had not attacked. The regiment had not been endangered. Mikkel had committed a technical violation born of exhaustion in a campaign that had pushed all of them beyond human limits of endurance. I was killing him to maintain my authority, to demonstrate that mercy was not in my nature, to ensure that the fear I inspired remained sharper than the exhaustion that made men's bodies betray them. The execution served no purpose beyond reinforcing the terror that kept discipline intact. I squeezed the trigger. The bolt round did its work. Mikkel's body collapsed forward. Blood pooled beneath him, reflecting the industrial lumens overhead in patterns that looked almost beautiful if you did not think about what created them. My hand had not shaken at all, not even slightly. The aim was perfect, the execution flawless. I holstered the pistol with the same mechanical precision I had developed over months of practice. The moral boundary had disappeared completely. I could no longer identify where duty ended and monstrosity began. The campaign on Tertium-9 eventually ground to conclusion. We took the fortress factory room by blood-soaked room until the heretics had nowhere left to retreat and died in their final stronghold like rats in a collapsing nest. The casualty reports listed our losses as acceptable. 2,300 guardsmen had entered the hive. 947 emerged. The Munitorum would replenish our ranks with fresh conscripts who would learn quickly or die, and the regiment would continue its service until attrition or enemy action rendered it combat ineffective. I had executed 11 men during the siege. Mikkel was simply one name among many in reports that documented infractions and responses with bureaucratic efficiency. The Departamento Munitorum did not care about moral ambiguity. They cared about results, and our results were satisfactory. During the lull that followed, while we waited for transport to our next deployment, I received a Vox transmission that changed everything. The message came through official Commissariat channels, encrypted with codes that ensured its contents reached only those who wore the storm coat. I decoded it in my quarters, alone as always, expecting routine administrative updates or doctrinal bulletins. Instead, I learned that Commissar Leonid Vros was dead. The official report listed equipment malfunction. His bolt pistol had discharged while he was cleaning it in his quarters. A tragic accident, the kind of thing that happened occasionally even to trained soldiers who should have known better. His body had been discovered by his aide, a junior officer who reported hearing a single gunshot and finding the Commissar dead with his own weapon in hand. I had known Vros at the Schola Progenium. We had trained together, studied together, competed for rankings in tactical assessments and marksmanship trials. He was meticulous in ways that bordered on obsessive. His equipment was always maintained to standards that exceeded regulation requirements. The idea that he would make a mistake during weapon cleaning, that his bolt pistol would somehow discharge and kill him, was absurd. But the report did not say what had actually happened because the report could not say what had actually happened. To acknowledge the truth would be to acknowledge a systemic vulnerability that the Commissariat could not afford to admit existed. So equipment malfunction became the official explanation, and anyone with the training to read between lines understood what those words actually meant. Leonid Vros had been murdered by his own troops. I sat in my quarters with the decoded message displayed on the data slate and felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of my position. The isolation I had experienced was not merely social awkwardness or the natural distance between authority and those subject to it. I was not simply separated from the regiment by duty and necessity. I was actively hunted by the very men I was meant to lead. Every time I turned my back, I presented an opportunity. Every time I slept, I was vulnerable. Every moment of inattention was a potential opening for someone who had decided that their fear of me was less than their hatred of me. The equilibrium I maintained through calculated terror was not stable. It was a knife edge, and falling off either side meant death. Too much leniency, and discipline would collapse. The regiment would cease to function as a military unit and become a mob that would be slaughtered by any competent enemy. Too much severity, and I would push them past the threshold where fear became rage, where the risk of my execution seemed preferable to continued existence under my authority. Somewhere between those extremes lay a zone of optimal terror, and I walked that narrow path every day without knowing precisely where the boundaries were until I had already crossed them. I thought about the last pistol I kept under my pillow, about how I locked my quarters from the inside and wedged a chair against the door. about how I never ate food that had not been sealed in standard Munitorum ration packs, about how I varied my patrol routes and timing to prevent anyone from predicting my movements with accuracy. These precautions had seemed like reasonable security measures. Now I understood they were survival necessities. Commissars died, not occasionally, but regularly. The official reports documented enemy action or equipment malfunction, or in cases where the truth could not be concealed, mutiny that resulted in summary execution of the perpetrators. But the reports did not capture the full scope of how many men wearing storm coats ended their service in unmarked graves or crematorium fires. How many were killed by soldiers who were careful enough to make it look like something else? How many simply disappeared during the chaos of combat when a last round from behind could be attributed to enemy action? The institution knew. The Commissariat was not naive about the dangers its members faced from their own troops. But the institution accepted this as part of the system's design. Commissars were tools, and tools wore out. Some broke against the enemy. Others were destroyed by the very mechanism they were meant to regulate. The end result was the same. The role would be refilled and the machine would continue operating. I had no allies. Colonel Hessen respected my function, but would not intervene if the men decided to kill me, as long as they maintained plausible deniability. The other officers viewed me as a necessary evil, but would feel no particular grief at my death. The enlisted men hated me with varying degrees of intensity, and some percentage of them were certainly calculating whether the risk of assassination was worth the reward of my absence. No one valued my survival beyond what it represented institutionally. I was not a person to them. I was a symbol of authority and fear. When that symbol ceased to function, either through my death or through erosion of effectiveness, it would be replaced with another symbol that wore a different face, but served the same purpose. The Emperor's servant was also the Emperor's sacrifice. The role was designed to be temporary. Whether death came from enemy fire or from a carefully placed last round to the back of my skull during the confusion of combat was almost irrelevant to the institution. The storm coat would be recovered, cleaned, and issued to whoever graduated next from the Schola Progenium with high enough marks to earn this honor. I thought of Vross, wondered if he had known, in his final moment, that his death was inevitable, whether he had felt relief or rage or simple acceptance. The knowledge that I was hunted changed something fundamental in how I approached my duty. If death was inevitable, if the role was designed to consume its occupants regardless of competence or caution, then the only rational response was to maximize effectiveness during whatever time remained. The calculations became simpler. The moral ambiguities that had troubled me after Mikhail's execution seemed indulgent, a waste of mental energy that could be better spent on mission objectives. I began to execute men preemptively, not for infractions they had committed, but for infractions I calculated they would commit. During moments of high stress, before major operations or after particularly devastating casualties, I would identify the weakest links in the regiment's psychological structure and eliminate them. A guardsman whose eyes had taken on that hollow quality, suggesting imminent breakdown. Another whose hands shook too badly during weapons inspection. Men who spoke too quietly or too frantically during briefings. The statistical models I had developed proved reliable. 90% of those I selected would have broken eventually. I simply accelerated the timeline. The executions became ritualized. I developed a procedure that maximized efficiency while maintaining the necessary theatrical element. The assembly of witnesses. The reading of charges that grew increasingly abstract. Potential cowardice. Probable dereliction. Calculated risk to unit cohesion. The positioning of the condemned. The single bolt round. The silence that followed. Each step performed with mechanical precision, that reduced human death to administrative process. I no longer remembered individual names unless I made specific effort to learn them beforehand. The faces blurred together into a procession of the condemned, differentiated only by minor variations in how they accepted their fate. Some wept, others maintained stoic silence. A few tried to run, which required additional last fire from the security detail I now brought to every execution. But these variations were superficial. In the moment before death, they all became the same. Obstacles to optimal unit performance, removed through application of doctrine and firepower. My speech patterns changed. I noticed this during a conversation with Colonel Hessen, heard myself speaking in clipped, emotionless phrases that conveyed maximum information with minimum words. Emotional nuance had become inefficient. When officers brought me disciplinary cases, I assessed them with the same analytical framework I would use to evaluate ammunition expenditure rates or vehicle maintenance schedules. Variables were measured, outcomes calculated, decisions rendered without the contamination of sentiment. I began to view emotional displays as weakness requiring correction. A soldier who showed fear needed to be reminded of his duty through proximity to my authority. A soldier who showed grief over a fallen comrade needed to understand that attachment was liability. The regiment was not a collection of individuals with bonds of friendship and shared experience. It was a weapon system composed of replaceable components. Sentimentality degraded performance. The acceptable casualty rates I calculated would have horrified the man I had been when I first joined the Volpone 51st. 20% losses during a frontal assault, 35% during urban clearance operations, 50% acceptable if the objective was strategically critical. These were not theoretical numbers, but actual human lives rendered as percentages. I presented them to Colonel Hessen with the same detachment a logistician would use when discussing ammunition consumption rates. He accepted my assessments because they were accurate, and accuracy was more valuable than compassion. Sleep became difficult in ways that had nothing to do with security concerns. I would lie in my locked quarters, las pistol within reach, and find that unconsciousness would not come. When it finally arrived, the dreams were strange. I saw the faces of the dead, all of them, stretching back to Petrov and forward to the guardsmen I had executed 3 days prior for reasons I could no longer clearly remember. But they did not accuse me. They did not rage or weep or plead. They simply stared with blank incomprehension, as if trying to understand why their existence had been terminated for violations of regulations they had never fully understood in the first place. The horror was not that I had become monstrous. The horror was that I had become exactly what the Imperium designed me to be, a functional instrument of terror that maintained discipline through calculated application of violence. The Schola Progenium had succeeded in its purpose. The training had worked precisely as intended. I was the perfect Commissar, efficient, merciless, and utterly empty of anything that might interfere with mission objectives. I caught my reflection in a shattered window during an urban combat operation on a world whose designation I no longer remembered. We were clearing a hab block, moving room to room through spaces that had once housed families and now housed only corpses and the occasional enemy holdout. Las fire and explosions created a soundtrack of constant violence. Someone's grenade had blown out the window, leaving jagged edges of reinforced glass that still clung to the frame. I stopped, looked at the face staring back at me from that broken mirror. The stormcoat was immaculate despite weeks in the field. I maintained it with religious precision, knowing that any degradation of appearance would signal weakness. The peaked cap sat at regulation angle, the insignia polished to mirror brightness. But the face beneath the uniform was gaunt in ways that suggested more than physical deprivation. The cheekbones too prominent, the skin stretched tight over skull. eyes that held no warmth, no humor, no trace of anything resembling human feeling. I did not recognize myself. Not because of the physical changes, though those were significant. I did not recognize the thing looking back because it was not a person anymore. It was a function wearing human shape, a weapon that happened to be made of flesh rather than metal. The transformation was complete. I turned away from my reflection and continued the clearance operation. There was no point in dwelling on what I had become. The mission required completion. The enemy required elimination. Discipline required maintenance. These were the only truths that mattered. Everything else was sentiment, and sentiment was weakness, and weakness had to be cut away until only purpose remained. The thing I had become proved its worth on a death world designated only as Mortressa 7, a planet where evolution had optimized every living organism for maximum lethality. The flora secreted toxins that caused flesh to necrotize on contact. The fauna hunted in packs with intelligence that suggested something more than animal instinct. The very air carried spores that colonized human lungs and grew into fungal masses that suffocated from the inside. We wore rebreathers constantly, changed filters every 6 hours, and still men died choking on their own liquefying tissue. The enemy was chaos cultists who had adapted to the environment through mutations that were equal parts biological evolution and demonic blessing. They moved through the toxic jungles like they were born to it, which perhaps they were after generations of exposure to whatever powers had claimed this world. We died at rates that made our previous campaigns seem merciful by comparison. Not the clean death of Last Fire or the quick obliteration of artillery, but slow degradation, infection, poison, disease, men rotting alive inside their uniforms while still required to hold their positions. Morale collapsed under the weight of an environment that killed more efficiently than any enemy we had ever faced. The executions increased. 2 per day, then 3. Men attempting to desert into jungles that would kill them anyway, but at least the death would be their choice, rather than something imposed by duty and discipline. I shot them and left their bodies where they fell as examples. The local scavengers consumed the remains within hours, which saved us the effort of burial details. Colonel Hessen died in the 5th week, an ambush that should have been survivable. Lasfire from cultists concealed in the canopy above our column. He took a round through the throat, severing the major arteries, bled out in 90 seconds despite the Medicai's efforts. I watched him die with the same detachment I watched everything else. Calculated the impact his loss would have on command effectiveness. Concluded it was manageable. The regiment had survived worse. His replacement arrived 3 days later. Colonel Arterius Vane, a man whose family had purchased his commission with wealth accumulated over generations of noble service. He wore his rank like inherited jewelry, something that signified status rather than competence. His uniform was too clean, his posture too perfect. His eyes held the idealism of someone who had learned warfare from tactical simulations and approved texts rather than from watching men die in ways that doctrine never anticipated. He called me to his command tent within hours of assuming leadership, studied me with barely concealed distaste while I stood at attention before his field desk. The tent smelled of reclaimed water and the chemical soap he used to maintain his appearance despite the environment trying to rot everything organic. "Commissar Carder," he said, managing to make my name sound like an accusation. "I have reviewed the disciplinary records. The execution rate under your tenure is significantly above standard parameters. The campaign has been difficult, Colonel. Morale maintenance has required firm intervention." Firm intervention. He repeated the words as if tasting something foul. "You have killed 47 members of this regiment in 4 months. That is not firm intervention. That is systematic culling." I said nothing. There was no response that would satisfy someone who spoke from ideology rather than experience. Discipline is important, Vane continued. I do not dispute this. But there are proper procedures, field tribunals, documentation, opportunities for the accused to present mitigating circumstances. You will submit all future disciplinary cases to my office for review before rendering judgment. The order was a death sentence for the regiment, though he lacked the experience to understand this. Bureaucratic review would create delays that discipline could not afford. Men facing potential execution would have time to conspire, to organize resistance, to calculate whether killing the Commissar was preferable to submitting to field tribunal. Colonel, the Tactica Imperium grants commissarial authority for summary execution in cases of... I am aware of commissarial authority, Carde. I am also aware that such authority must be exercised within the bounds of military justice. You will comply with my directive, or I will file charges with the Commissariat for exceeding your mandate. Within a week, discipline began to fracture. The first case I referred to Vane's tribunal involved a guardsman who had struck his squad leader during an argument over ration distribution. Clear insubordination. Capital offense. The tribunal took 3 days to convene, heard testimony from witnesses, and ultimately assigned punishment duty rather than execution. The guardsman returned to his unit having learned that defiance could be survived. Desertions increased. Men who would have been deterred by the certainty of immediate execution now calculated odds and found them acceptable. 2 squads disappeared into the jungle during a night march. We found their bodies eventually, transformed by the environment into things that were no longer recognizably human. But their deaths came from their own choice rather than from my bolt pistol, and that distinction mattered to others, contemplating the same escape. The collapse came during a holding action against a cultist assault on our supply depot. 3rd Platoon's 2nd Squad abandoned their position without authorization, simply melted away into the jungle while the enemy advanced. The breach they created allowed cultists to flank our defensive line. 50 men died in the resulting chaos before we could re-establish coherent resistance and drive the enemy back. I found the deserters 6 hours later. They had not run far. The jungle had slowed them, and they lacked the skill to move through terrain that required expertise they did not possess. I executed all 9 of them, 1 bolt round each. No tribunal, no authorization from Colonel Vane. Just the application of justice that should have been applied before they had the opportunity to cause 50 deaths. Vane summoned me again. His face was red with rage, barely controlled by aristocratic training. You directly violated my orders, Commissar. I specifically instructed that all disciplinary cases be referred to proper tribunal. Those men caused the deaths of 50 soldiers through their cowardice. Summary execution was the only appropriate response. You do not make that determination. I make that determination. Your authority exists at my discretion. My authority exists through the Commissariat and the God Emperor's mandate, not through your discretion, Colonel. The words hung between us like drawn weapons. I had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Either he would yield and acknowledge that discipline required methods his idealism found distasteful, or he would follow through on his threat and charge me with exceeding my mandate. Either option led to destruction. His surrender would undermine command authority. My removal would complete the collapse of discipline that had already begun. There was no correct choice, only degrees of damnation. The confrontation with Colonel Vane became irrelevant when the cultists launched their final offensive. They came at dawn, when the mist rising from the toxic jungle floor created visibility conditions that reduced our sensor range to almost nothing. They came in numbers that suggested they had been massing for weeks. drawing reinforcements from wherever chaos worshippers bred in this planet's rotting depths. They came with the absolute conviction that their dark gods had promised them victory, and that conviction made them fearless in ways that discipline and training could never replicate. We had been ground down to 60% strength. Supplies were exhausted, ammunition rationed to 10 power packs per guardsman, medical supplies depleted to the point where even minor wounds became death sentences through infection. The reinforcements that had been promised were weeks away, assuming they came at all. Command had already written off Mortressa 7 as strategically irrelevant. We were fighting and dying for a world that no one wanted, simply because withdrawing would mean acknowledging defeat. The cultists broke through our outer defensive line within the first hour. We fell back to secondary positions that had been prepared for exactly this contingency, held there for 3 hours until ammunition scarcity and mounting casualties made those positions untenable, fell back again to the final defensive. Perimeter around our command post and supply depot. There was nowhere left to retreat. The jungle pressed in on all sides. The enemy surrounded us completely. Colonel Vane convened his officers in the command tent, while last fire and explosions created a constant thunder that made speech difficult. I stood at the edge of the gathering, technically present but separated by the gulf that always existed between Commissar and command staff. Vane studied the tactical display with the expression of someone watching his idealism die in real time. "Gentlemen," he said, and his voice carried the brittleness of someone maintaining composure through force of will alone. "We cannot hold this position. Our ammunition will be exhausted within 6 hours. Medical facilities are overwhelmed. Morale is critically degraded. I am ordering a fighting retreat to the extraction point designated Alpha 7. We will break through the encirclement to the east and march through the night." The other officers received this with varying degrees of resignation. They understood what he was proposing, even if Vane himself did not want to acknowledge it. A fighting retreat through hostile jungle with an enemy in pursuit and men already at the edge of psychological collapse would not remain a retreat for long. It would become a rout. Men would break and run. Unit cohesion would disintegrate. The cultists would hunt us through terrain they knew better than we did, and we would die scattered and alone instead of together behind fortifications. "Colonel," I said, and every head turned toward me, "that order will result in the complete destruction of this regiment." Vane's jaw tightened. "Your opinion is noted, Commissar, but tactical decisions are mine to make. Tactical decisions that preserve the regiment's fighting capability are yours to make. Orders that guarantee its destruction are not. Are you countermanding my order?" His voice rose with incredulity and rage. "In front of my officers, you have no authority to..." "I am exercising my authority to maintain discipline and morale. This regiment will hold this position. Reinforcements will arrive, or we will die holding ground rather than scattered through jungle being hunted like animals." The silence in the command tent was absolute despite the battle raging outside. Every officer present understood they were witnessing something that should not happen. The entire command structure of the Imperial Guard depended on clear hierarchy. Commissars enforced discipline, but did not supersede command authority. What I was doing violated every principle of military order. Vane's face had gone pale with fury. "You are relieved of duty, Commissar Carter. Guards, place this man under arrest for insubordination and usurpation of command authority." 2 junior officers moved hesitantly toward me. Their hands did not reach for their sidearms, but their body language suggested they would comply with the colonel's order if I did, not yield. Outside, the sound of last fire intensified. Someone was screaming orders about falling back to inner positions. The perimeter was contracting. I faced the ultimate commissarial paradox. My entire purpose was to enforce discipline and maintain the chain of command. But that enforcement required me to violate the very authority I was meant to uphold. Either I submitted to Vane's order and watched the regiment destroy itself through retreat that would become rout, or I asserted authority that exceeded my mandate and became the very thing I was supposed to prevent, a disruption of military hierarchy. I drew my bolt pistol, not aimed at Vane, though every man in the tent thought that was my intention. Instead, I turned toward Lieutenant Marks, a junior officer I had been watching for weeks. His eyes held that hollowness I had learned to recognize. His hands trembled. His voice during briefings carried the edge of hysteria barely controlled. He was the weak point, the man most likely to break first when the retreat began and transform organized withdrawal into panicked flight. I shot him. The bolt round caught him in the center of mass. He died before his body hit the ground. The report of the weapon in the enclosed space of the command tent was deafening. Blood sprayed across the tactical display, obscuring the map coordinates that showed our encirclement. "Discipline will be maintained," I said into the ringing silence that followed. "Any man who breaks will be executed. Any man who runs will be executed. Any man who suggests retreat will be executed. We hold this position. That is not a request or a suggestion. It is the only order that matters." I turned my gaze to Colonel Vane. The bolt pistol remained in my hand, not aimed at him, but not holstered either. The message was clear without being spoken. I had crossed every line. I had violated every principle of command structure. I had become something that existed outside the normal hierarchy, enforcing order through pure terror regardless of who opposed it. Vane looked at Lieutenant Marks's body, at the blood pooling on the floor, at the faces of his other officers who had gone rigid with the understanding that discipline had been reduced to its most fundamental element: immediate violence against anyone who threatened cohesion. He could order my arrest again, could follow through on his threat, but doing so would require someone to actually carry out that order, and no one in the tent was willing to be the second example. "Hold the line," Vane said quietly. His surrender was complete. We held for 18 hours against overwhelming numbers. Men fought because they were more afraid of me than they were of the enemy or death itself. When they ran out of power packs, they fixed bayonets. When exhaustion made them stumble, they forced themselves upright because collapsing might be interpreted as cowardice. 3 more men tried to desert during the night. I executed them in front of their squads. The rest held their positions. Reinforcements arrived at dawn of the second day. Fresh troops, supplied and rested, who swept through the cultist positions and broke their offensive. We had survived. The regiment remained intact as a fighting unit. The casualties were heavy but acceptable given the circumstances. I had enforced order through an act that was simultaneously my duty and a betrayal of every principle I had been trained to uphold. I had become exactly what the Imperium required, a monster sanctified by necessity, but damned by action. The Emperor's calculus revealed in its totality. The Imperium needed monsters to survive, and Commissars were those monsters, wearing stormcoats and maintaining discipline through methods that civilized humans should find abhorrent. I was irredeemable, but the regiment lived. The weeks that followed felt like echoes of something that had already ended. The Volpone 51st was relieved from Mortressa 7, with casualty rates that would have destroyed lesser regiments. We received reinforcements, fresh conscripts with clean uniforms and eyes that had not yet learned what the stormcoat meant. They would learn. They always did. The regiment was redeployed to garrison duty on a civilized world, while command determined where we would be thrown next into the Emperor's eternal war. Colonel Vane requested transfer. His replacement was a veteran who understood that survival required methods that doctrine did not explicitly authorize. We did not speak of what had happened in the command tent. The official reports documented a successful defensive action. Lieutenant Marks was listed as killed in action by enemy fire. The truth existed only in the memories of those who had witnessed it, and none of them would speak of it aloud. I stood over another body, not in formation before assembled troops, but in the darkness of my quarters during the 3rd hour of morning, when human vigilance reaches its lowest ebb. The guardsman had entered through a ventilation shaft that regulations said was too small for human passage. Desperation makes men capable of remarkable things. He had come with a knife, moving with the careful silence of someone who had planned this moment meticulously. But I no longer slept deeply. Had not slept deeply since learning of Vross's death. Some part of my consciousness remained alert even in unconsciousness, monitoring for the sounds that meant danger. The scrape of metal on metal as he descended from the ventilation shaft. The whisper of breath controlled but still audible in the silence. The soft pressure of weight shifting on the floor near my cot. I woke with the las pistol already in my hand. Fired before conscious thought caught up with trained reflex. The las bolt caught him in the chest. He collapsed without making a sound beyond the wet impact of body hitting floor. I stood over him in the darkness, breathing the smell of burned flesh and ozone, and felt nothing at all. His name was Davish. No, that had been someone else. Weeks ago or months ago or years ago, the names had ceased to matter. This one was Kellen. I remembered now because I had executed his squad mate for desertion during the Mortressa campaign. He had been planning this revenge ever since, had been careful, had waited until he thought my guard might lower, had been wrong. No one had witnessed the attempt. The barracks were quiet. The other officers quartered far enough away that a single las pistol discharge would not wake them, or if it did, they would assume equipment maintenance or cleaning accident. I could report this, file charges posthumously, have his family stripped of whatever honors his service might have earned them, make an example that would deter others from similar attempts. I chose silence, dragged the body to the disposal chute myself. It was heavier than I expected. Dead weight always is. The chute accepted it with the mechanical efficiency of imperial infrastructure designed to handle waste. Organic matter would be processed, reclaimed, converted into something useful. Nothing was wasted in the Imperium's economy of survival. I returned to my quarters, cleaned the blood from the floor with chemical solution kept for exactly this purpose, sealed the ventilation shaft with expanding foam that would harden by morning, changed my uniform because the one I had been sleeping in carried blood spatter. When everything was restored to order, I sat on the edge of my cot with the bolt pistol in my hand. The weapon was warm from the heat of my body, where I had kept it under the pillow. I studied it in the dim light that filtered through the window from the exterior lumens. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every surface polished to mirror brightness. The grip worn smooth from years of use. The mechanism maintained with religious devotion because a malfunction could mean death in dozens of different scenarios. I realized I felt nothing. Not anger at the attempt on my life. Not righteousness at having prevented it. Not even the satisfaction of survival. The emotions that should have accompanied such a moment were simply absent. I had become the perfect Commissar. Efficient, merciless, utterly alone. A function that happened to inhabit human form but had ceased to be human in any meaningful sense. The silence pressed in around me, the same silence I had experienced standing over Davish's body at the opening of this campaign, when I first recognized that my hand no longer shook. But I understood it differently now. The silence was not merely the hatred of my men, or the weight of their fearful obedience. It was the absence of my own humanity, the void where emotions and connections, and everything that made existence more than simple continuation, had once resided. I holstered the bolt pistol with the mechanical precision that had become automatic, prepared my reports for the morning. reviewed the duty roster, and identified 3 guardsmen who would require monitoring based on behavioral indicators suggesting potential disciplinary issues. Tomorrow would bring more battles or more garrison duties, more failures of discipline requiring correction, more executions to maintain the terror that kept men functioning beyond their natural limits. The role did not end. It only ground down its occupants until they were replaced by fresh commissars who would repeat the cycle until they too became hollow instruments of institutional cruelty. I thought of Vross and his equipment malfunction, wondered how long until I followed him, whether it would be a guardsman who succeeded where Kellen had failed, or enemy action, or simply the accumulated weight of what I had become finally crushing whatever spark of consciousness still animated this body. I realized I did not care. The realization should have disturbed me. Instead, it brought something approaching peace. The duty would continue with or without me. The Stormcoat would be recovered and issued to whoever graduated next from the Scholar Progenium, with high enough marks to earn this honor. They would believe, as I had believed, that they were entering glorious service. They would learn, as I had learned, what glory actually cost. The Emperor protects. We say this endlessly. We carve it into walls and equipment. We whisper it as prayer before battle. But the Emperor does not protect commissars. That is the price of the Stormcoat, and I have paid it in full, in blood and terror, and the slow erasure of everything that might have made me human. The debt is settled. What remains is simply waiting for the inevitable conclusion. I extinguished the light and lay back on my cot. Tomorrow would come, and the day after, and the day after that, until one day it would not, and someone else would wear the Stormcoat and stand in the silence and become the monster that the Imperium requires for its survival. This is what it means to be a commissar. This is why it sucks.